When I was 18 years old, I was living in a small town where not much happened. I'd just gotten my driver's license, and my mom let me borrow her car whenever I wanted. The freedom was exciting, even if there wasn't a lot to do with it. Like I said, my town was really small, and even with a car, there wasn't much to do there. My friends and I would usually end up driving to a larger town, about 45 minutes away. It was still pretty quiet, but at least it had a few more places to go. There were some fast food spots, a decent arcade, and a movie theater that was still open. Between our town and the larger one, it was just fields and open road. You'd pass a few farms and some rundown buildings, but that was about it. On the outskirts of the bigger town, there were also a few abandoned buildings, including an old mall and a movie theater that had been shut down for years. The place looked eerie during the day, and even more so at night, but that didn't stop us from driving by once in a while, just for the weird atmosphere. One night, my friend Alex and I were cruising around, not really sure what to do. We'd already driven around town a couple of times, so we ended up heading toward the abandoned mall. We were hoping to come up with a plan while we walked around. When we got there, we parked the car in a small lot nearby and got out. The mall was surrounded by a tall chain-link fence with no trespassing signs posted every few feet. We could see the empty storefronts and faded signs through the gaps in the fence, but there wasn't an easy way through, and neither of us felt like jumping the fence. Therefore, we decided to keep walking. As we kept going, it started getting dark. Most of the businesses around were closed, so the area felt deserted. Eventually, we ended up near the abandoned movie theater, and I could tell Alex was getting a little restless. He wasn't a fan of deserted places, especially at night, but I was more curious than him. We walked around the building's backside. It was dark there, and we both had our phones out for light. It was extremely run down back at that part of the parking lot. The pavement was cracked, and weeds were growing up through the rubble. At some point, Alex spotted a gap in the fence. It was narrow, but it was big enough for us to slip through if we wanted. He looked at me, and I could tell he wasn't thrilled about the idea, but he didn't say no. I was able to talk him into going, so we squeezed through the gap and made our way around to the side of the building, which was full of broken windows, and there was trash scattered around. It felt strange to be so close to the old place. You could almost imagine how it must have looked years ago, when it was still open. That was before my time, but I could picture it. Then we noticed an open door. I was curious enough to go inside, but Alex hesitated. He said we'd probably get in trouble if we got caught trespassing, but I told him that we'd just take a quick look. Then I went in. After a moment, he followed. We kept our phone flashlights on, and I led the way in. The inside was dark and smelled like mildew, but we could see well enough. The walls were lined with movie posters that had faded with age, and the carpet looked like it had been torn up in some spots. The place was completely silent, except for the crunch of broken glass under our shoes. The whole time, Alex kept telling me we should leave. He didn't like how quiet it was, and he didn't want to push our luck by trespassing anymore. I told him I just wanted to see one of the old theater rooms, and after a bit of convincing, he agreed. The truth is that I was getting annoyed by his whining, but I didn't want to be in there alone either, so I had to be nice to him. We walked down a hallway that must have led to the theater rooms. Then we heard footsteps, and they definitely weren't ours. I froze, and Alex looked at me, his eyes wide. Before we had time to figure out what to do, we turned a corner and saw two guys up ahead. They looked older than us, maybe late 20s, and they had a rough look about them. One of the guys noticed us and shouted, "Hey, come here." That was enough for Alex. He turned and bolted back the way we came. I didn't think twice and ran after him. We managed to make it out of the door, then we squeezed back through the fence. We didn't stop until we were out on the street, and by then, we were breathing hard. We started making our way back to my car, and then I glanced back at the theater. Through one of the windows, I saw one of the men standing there on the second floor. We locked eyes, and he shook his head slowly, then pulled a gun from his waistband. He pointed it at his own head and pretended to shoot. His head jolted back, then he slumped forward. When he stood back up, he looked at me again, then he started laughing. I ran the rest of the way to the car, and then me and Alex got in. We got out of there safely. To this day, I still don't know what he meant by that gesture, whether it was a threat or just him trying to mess with us, I'm not sure, but it was enough to make us swear never to go back there again. Last year, some friends and I decided to catch a movie on a Saturday night. We were 15, and it was something we did every couple of weekends. That night, it was me, Dylan, Cam, and Alex. Dylan had brought along his younger brother Taylor, who was only 10. Taylor was a nice kid, and since he didn't tag along often, nobody minded that he was with us. The 5 of us got a ride there and went into the theater. After we got our tickets, Dylan bought popcorn and some drinks for everyone. Then we went in, found our seats, and waited for the movie. About 10 minutes in, I noticed a guy sitting a few rows ahead who kept glancing over his shoulder. At first I thought he was looking at something else, or maybe he was waiting for someone, but it kept happening. He was in his early 20s and was there by himself, which wasn't too weird. The weird part was how often he looked back in our direction. I couldn't tell if he was staring at us specifically or just looking around. He had short hair and a beard. He was wearing a dark jacket that he hadn't bothered to take off, even though the theater was warm. I leaned over to Dylan and whispered, "That guy keeps looking back," but he didn't seem to care. After a few more glances, I tried to ignore it and focused on the movie. I didn't feel like causing a scene over a guy just looking around, but it left me feeling a bit on edge. Throughout the movie, the guy kept glancing back every 10 or 15 minutes. Sometimes he turned his head almost all the way, which felt unusual. I was tempted to make eye contact to see if he would stop, but it felt like overreacting. Besides, the movie was good, and I wanted to enjoy it. I noticed Taylor glancing at him too, but he didn't seem too bothered, so I let it go. Finally, it was over and the credits started rolling. We stayed seated to watch them, like we always did, even though most people had already left. When they were over, we got up to head out. As we were gathering our stuff, I saw the guy stand up too. He was one of the few people still there. He walked down the aisle and then stopped near the exit, waiting. As we walked by, he started following us out. At this point, he was close enough that I could see him walking right behind Cam. I kept an eye on him as we moved through the lobby. He kept his distance, but seemed to stay within a few steps of us. I didn't want to make a big deal out of it if there was nothing wrong, so I just stuck close to Taylor and Dylan, trying to look casual while watching him out of the corner of my eye. We made it outside, and I figured he'd leave now that we were all in the open, but he hung back by the door. We called my parents for a ride and waited by the front entrance. It was already getting dark outside, and the streetlights had just turned on. We were talking and joking around when Taylor suddenly said he needed to go to the bathroom. Dylan offered to take him back inside, and the two of them headed in while the rest of us waited out front. After about 5 minutes, I looked up and saw Taylor coming out of the theater doors, but something was wrong. He wasn't with Dylan. Instead, he was walking next to that guy who'd been watching us in the theater. My stomach dropped, and I felt an intense urge to go over and get him. I barely thought about it. I just walked straight up to them and grabbed Taylor's hand, pulling him over to me. I could see the guy's eyes widen when I made contact with Taylor. The moment I grabbed him, the guy took off, bolting down the sidewalk without looking back. I looked around and spotted Dylan coming out of the bathroom looking confused. I told him what had just happened, and he didn't waste any time pulling out his phone to call his parents. We made sure Taylor was okay, and stayed together until my parents arrived. We all went home shaken up, knowing how quickly things could have gone differently if I hadn't seen Taylor walk out with that guy. It was a night I didn't forget. After that, I always kept an eye out at the movies, watching the people around us a little more closely. It was October 8th of 2012, and I was 29 years old. I had just started working at a very old movie theater on the Oregon coast. I had always wanted to work in one, even though it had this dank and unsettling feeling. I just shook it off as a really cool, nostalgic place. Working at a movie theater meant working late, and it made me laugh when other employees would ask for the opening shift. Recently, I was given the responsibility of building the films. Back then, the movies came in 35mm format, often in 4 different reels. This was not easy work to put them together. We had an upstairs that we called the booth, where we had 6 projectors, nothing digital in this theater. I usually started by gathering all the tags, the film cutter, and every other tiny detail needed to be ready. If you didn't put the film together correctly, you'd likely watch the start of a movie in the middle or miss the end. My responsibility was to do a full quality check after building the film, and I got paid to watch the entire movie if I was the one who built it. By the time I finished building the movie, it was around midnight. My boss trusted me enough to be totally alone in the theater after she left. I spent about another 45 minutes moving the reels onto a plate for viewing. Bear in mind, these reels could weigh up to 300 pounds, and I'm not that big of a guy. After MacGyvering this thing, I felt a tiny shiver. Trust me, at night with the lights turned off, this place could be terrifying, with the old building making noises. I decided to check all the exit doors and entrances, as I had heard stories about previous employees encountering homeless people walking in at night. Everything was locked up tight. The movie I was previewing that night was Sinister with Ethan Hawke. All I knew about the film was that it was a horror movie. I threaded the film, which was extremely technical, and hurried down so I wouldn't miss the trailers. After about 10 minutes, I started feeling very cold. This was quite an old theater with a really poor HVAC system. I distinctly remember turning up the heat, knowing it was the only theater where the HVAC unit really worked. I went upstairs to check quickly, and it showed that the heat was on. Instead of fiddling with it, I just took out the batteries and turned it off. After half an hour of the film, I realized there was still cold air, not just blowing on me, but around me. I shrugged it off and continued watching. This is where I encountered the three spirits in this building. If you've seen the movie Sinister, you will recognize this part. I was at the horrifying scene, where the whole family is tied up on the lawn, and a lawnmower goes over each of their heads. The auditorium suddenly had this vapor of dread. It felt like it was underneath the seats, moving. I don't spook easily, and I have many other stories not just about this theater, but many other spots throughout the coast. I just brushed it off, thinking the movie was scaring me. After about 20 minutes, in my peripheral vision to my right, I noticed someone was there. I snapped my head to that area, and as clear as day, a woman in her 30s was staring at me. She was wearing a white, somewhat patterned dress that went down to her ankles. I couldn't see her face or hands as the theater was still pretty dark. The one thing I saw was unmistakable. She was smiling at me. After about 3 seconds, she turned to her right and disappeared through the entrance doors. I jumped in terror out of my seat, the movie still playing with intense music and screaming. I started scrambling through the aisle. I liked sitting in the center when I was alone watching a movie. It got even colder, and the air above my head felt like I couldn't feel it. I ran up the aisle, and my legs started feeling wobbly. Outside the auditorium was an exit on the left-hand side. I threw myself into the guide bar, feeling the late-night breeze absorbing the sweat from my brow. The backside of the theater was wide open, with forestry behind it. I went about 200 feet and sat on the sidewalk. Words couldn't describe the whirlwind of fear, confusion, and raw dread that consumed me. The most terrifying part was the realization that I had to go back inside. As everyone else at the theater would say, I had to put the babies to sleep, which meant a daunting journey through the darkened theater to reach the upstairs booth. During my first 2 weeks at the theater, ex-employees had cryptically warned me about encountering the 3 demons that haunted the place. They spoke of a demon lurking in the booth room upstairs, another invisible demon leaving mysterious footprints in sand, and a third specter wandering the aisles outside the auditorium, occasionally venturing inside. Despite my experience with ghostly encounters, the story still sent shivers down my spine. Summoning all my courage, I forced myself to stand up and make my way back into the theater. Each step felt awkward and hesitant, like a condemned man walking towards his fate. As I cautiously pushed open the door and re-entered the dimly lit halls, the air felt heavy with an eerie stillness, but the initial sense of paranoia began to subside. Upon reaching the projector room, I swiftly shut down all but one of the projectors. As I approached the 6th projector, knowing one of the demons was said to linger in that area, I hesitantly flicked on the light. To my relief, there was no one there, but as I glanced at the port glass where the film was projected onto the screen, a chilling reflection caught my eye. The face that stared back at me was the embodiment of evil, worn, sunken eyes, and a thin mustache. The sheer terror I felt in that moment propelled me to flee through the darkened booth, racing down the stairs and through the lobby. As I reached the entrance and locked up the building, a sense of relief washed over me. But as I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. Looking back at the theater, I noticed a window in Theater 6 where I had left the light on. To my horror, the window was now open, adding a final touch of dread to my already harrowing experience. Despite this terrifying encounter, I continued to work at the theater for many more years, encountering numerous other chilling experiences. Perhaps one day, I will share more of these unsettling tales with you.